So now we're looking at cash rate determination, video 3.6. So I've got a diagram here that I've taken from the explainer titled How the RBA Implements Monetary Policy. Now that explainer, it's a little bit complicated. I think it's difficult to understand unless you know a little bit about how the market actually works. So I'm quite happy for you to just use this video and the previous video as the main source of information about the cash market without getting bogged down in this particular reading. So certainly read it. It might help clarify a few things, but the risk is it just confuses you a little bit more. So we certainly don't want that. So this is a representation of the Australian cash market. It's the overnight cash market, that market for one-day borrowing. We have a supply curve of money and we have a demand curve of money. I'm assuming that the central bank has set the target cash rate at 3.5%. Now these numbers here are just something I've added to this diagram to help me explain to you what's going on in this diagram. So the target cash rate is 3.5%. So supply demand. So we've got the interest rate on the vertical axis, and they've labeled this vertical axis as the price. It's really the price of money in this market. That's what that label is getting at. So what is the price of money in this market? Well, this market is borrowed and loaned. So this the price of money in this market is the interest rate that you pay to borrow money. And then on the horizontal, we've got the quantity of money in this market. So the interest rate on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal. Now, the deposit rate. Even though the cash rate is 3.5%, the RBA deposit rate is the interest rate, in this case, 25 basis points less than the target cash rate. This interest rate down here of 3.25% is the interest rate that the Reserve Bank pays the banks in this overnight cash market for balances in the bank's exchange settlement accounts. So straight away, you can see the incentive, an incentive exists for the banks to lend money in this market. So if you're the ANZ Bank and you've got money sitting in your exchange settlement account at the end of the day, you'll earn 3.25%. But if you loan that money out to another bank, you'll actually charge them 3.5%. So you'll earn an additional 25 basis points. So obviously, simply because of that, an incentive exists for you to lend money out whenever it is required by another bank, because you'll be earning a slightly higher interest rate. And then this lending rate is the rate that the Reserve Bank will lend at to banks in this market. So if a bank ever got into trouble in this market and couldn't borrow money from any other source, and that's very unlikely because the market operates very competitively, very freely, but if another bank got into trouble and no other bank wanted to lend it money, then the Reserve Bank could step in and lend money at the cash rate plus 0.25%. So this difference between the deposit rate, the interest rate that you get on the balance of your exchange settlement account, and the interest rate that the Reserve Bank will loan money at is called the policy interest rate corridor. And so if the cash rate was or the cash rate target was increased to 4%, then these numbers would increase to 3.75 and 4.25. So the deposit rate is always 0.25% lower than the cash rate, and the lending rate is always 0.25% more than the cash rate. Those numbers don't change. It's always 25 basis points more, 25 basis points less. So when the cash rate changes, these other interest rates, the deposit rate and the lending rate, change in proportion. So the Reserve Bank will come along and set a target cash rate. If it wants to lift the target cash rate from 3.5% to 3.75%, the question is, well, what does it need to do that? The answer is nothing. To change the cash rate, nothing major. They simply go into the market and announce that there is a new cash rate target. And if it's a 25 basis point increase, now remember 25 basis points means 0.25%. So 1 basis point in terms of interest rate terminology, 1 basis point is 0.01%. It's a 1/100%. So when I say 25 basis points, I mean 0.25%. So if the Reserve Bank wants to increase the cash rate by 25 basis points up to 3.75%, it announces that at the start of the day, before trading starts, and automatically the cash rate will jump up to 3.75%. And then the deposit rate, the lending rate, they would also jump up by 25 basis points as well. So the Reserve Bank doesn't need to decrease the amount of money in this market to raise the cash rate. And they don't need to increase the amount of money in this market to lower the cash rate. Okay, they simply go into the market and announce the new cash rate, and they've got such control, such power over this market that the market responds immediately. The market, in effect, does what the Reserve Bank tells it to do, and it automatically adjusts the cash rate up to the new target level. There's no point in trying to fight the Reserve Bank in this market. It's just a fight you'll lose. So even if there were a group of banks who looked at the Reserve Bank and said, we don't want to move the cash rate up to 3.75, we want to keep it at 3.5, it just wouldn't work. Because what the Reserve Bank would then do is come into this market and start withdrawing money out of this market. It would do that by selling bonds. The banks would buy the bonds and pay the central bank for the bonds, and money would leave the market. And as the availability of money in this market decreased from its standard amount of about 750 million down to some much smaller amount, there'd be such scarcity of money in this market that the cash rate would just naturally start rising because of the scarcity of money. And so there's no point even trying to play that game if you're a bank. You've got a market regulator, the market just does what it is told in terms of the cash rate. Now this is where this diagram is a little bit misleading. I think the Reserve Bank have done it this way in their explainer to try to make it consistent with this sort of theory of loanable funds. What this suggests is that if the supply of money, and just imagine that vertical line being right there at 750 million. So 750 million on the horizontal. That matches the 750 million here. So that line is vertical at 750 million. If they started decreasing the supply of money in this market, this diagram suggests that equilibrium between demand and supply would start moving up this demand curve, and cash rate would start rising above the target. Now, in reality, it doesn't quite work that way. I spoke to someone a couple of years ago who runs this market, an ex-UWA graduate, and he was saying to me that while the supply curve is at 750, while that is true, if the Reserve Bank started decreasing the amount of money in this market, the cash rate wouldn't change. That was his understanding of the market. And he said to me that he believed that the market, or the supply of money in this market could drop to about $400 million. So from 750 to about 400 before it started putting upward pressure on the cash rate. And he also said that the supply could increase all the way out to about 1.5 billion before it started putting downward pressure on the cash rate. So it's almost like this demand curve has a horizontal section here. Okay, now that's something which is too complicated to include in an explainer, and it's probably something that the Reserve Bank doesn't want everyone knowing. Obviously, we're not everyone, are we? But yeah, that's kind of the way the market works. So the Reserve Bank does have a little bit of scope to allow the amount of money that is the vertical position of the supply curve, to move left and right without it adjusting the cash rate. So there is this horizontal range of the demand curve over which that would occur. Now, the Reserve Bank never really tests that. It never really allows the amount of money to explode out to 1.5 billion. It never allows the amount of money in this market to shrink to 400 million. So it doesn't really know what would happen if that did happen. So that was just the feeling of the person that I was speaking to at the Reserve Bank, that they do have a corridor between about 400 million and 1.5 billion over which they could allow the supply of money to move. That is the vertical supply curve moving left or right without the cash rate actually changing. So that's the way it works. So the deposit rate of 3.25 relative to the higher cash rate always provides an incentive for one bank to lend money to another when loans are required in this market. And the 3.75, that the lending rate, that's really just there as an emergency measure. In normal economic times, the Reserve Bank generally doesn't lend to these banks at this lending rate. It's only during times of emergency, global financial crisis, the COVID crisis, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the way the market works. So hopefully from the last video and this video, you've got a fairly good understanding of what the cash market is, the overnight cash market. The participants are financial institutions. You don't get governments operating in here, you don't get companies operating in here. Although if a company did want to invest money in this market, it could do so through one of its financial institutions or one of these financial institutions. So we know what the cash rate is, we know what the overnight cash market is, and also these lending and deposit rates. So what we'll be looking at next in topic 4 is bond markets. And just keep in mind, so if we go back, we'll now be in topic 4, we'll be looking at these longer term debt markets, bond markets. But just keep in mind, we are moving towards an understanding of how the cash rate affects interest rates such as mortgage interest rates on student loans, car loans, small business loans, etc. We're moving towards that understanding. Just keep in mind for now, when banks lend customers money, they get about 60% of that money from the deposits, the savings accounts of other customers. They get about 20% by issuing bank bills in short-term debt markets, and they get the other 20% by issuing bank bonds in these bond markets. So understanding what these short-term debt markets are about, what these bond markets are about, is going to help us understand how banks borrow money, price they have to pay when they borrow that money, or the interest rate they have to pay, more correctly. And also, it'll become increasingly clear as we move through the course how changes in this one-day interest rate flow through and affect other interest rates that actually affect aggregate demand, such as mortgage interest rates, personal loan interest rates, that sort of thing. Okay, so this is only topic 3, week 3. We're sort of building up our knowledge base at the moment. Now, I have gone through these short-term debt markets. They operate in a very similar way in all developed countries in the world. So if you went to the UK, you would have a very similar setup. The US, very similar. Canada, very similar. New Zealand, the same. So by learning about these markets in Australia, we're also getting some sort of idea about how they operate in other countries around the world as well. But just when you see short-term debt, long-term debt, these are markets for loanable funds. We have borrowers in these markets, we have lenders in these markets. And each of these markets will have different interest rates. Okay, and I'll talk more about how interest rates differ across this whole range of different durations of lending, I'll explain how all of that works in the next topic. So that's the end of topic 3.